Jake Martinez stepped off the transport ship and stared at the massive building in front of him. The Zentari Galactic Academy stretched up into the purple sky like a metal mountain. Towers twisted and curved in ways that hurt his eyes to follow. Strange symbols glowed along the walls in colors he had never seen before. His stomach felt tight with nerves. Back on Earth, he had been the best math student at his university. Here, surrounded by aliens who could probably calculate the distance between stars in their heads, he felt very small. Other students walked past him toward the academy entrance. A group of tall, gray beings with 4 arms moved together, speaking, in clicks and whistles. Their heads were twice the size of a human head, and Jake had heard they could solve equations that would take Earth's computers hours to figure out. Near them walked creatures that looked like walking crystals. Light bounced off their bodies as they moved, and each step made a soft ringing sound like bells. These were the Selenites, famous across the galaxy for seeing mathematical patterns that other species missed completely. Jake picked up his small bag and followed the crowd. He tried not to think about how his bag looked compared to the floating containers and energy cases the other students carried. Everything about him screamed that he was different, that he did not belong here. The entrance hall was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them, and the walls were covered with moving equations that shifted and changed as he watched. Hundreds of students from dozens of different species filled the space, all talking in languages Jake could not understand. A device in his ear translated the words, but the sounds were still strange. He heard phrases like quantum dimensional, matrices, and 17-level probability cascades that made his head spin. On Earth, he thought he was smart. Here, he felt like a child who had wandered into a room full of professors. "Attention, candidates," a voice boomed through the hall. The talking stopped immediately. All eyes turned to a raised platform where a massive creature stood. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, with skin like black metal and eyes that glowed red. This was a Vorthak, one of the species known for perfect logic and mathematical precision. "I am Headmaster Crixvel," the creature said. Its voice was deep and cold. "You have come here seeking admission to the most prestigious institution of learning in the galaxy. Most of you will fail." Jake felt his hands start to sweat. Around him, other students stood perfectly still, but he could feel the tension in the air. "This academy has maintained its standards for over 3,000 years, Crixvel continued. "Only the most exceptional minds earn a place here. Our entrance examination has a success rate of exactly 2% across all species." 2%. Jake did the math quickly. With nearly 800 students in this hall, only about 16 would pass, maybe less. "The examination will test not just your knowledge, but your ability to think beyond the limitations of your species," the headmaster said. His red eyes seemed to look directly at Jake for a moment. "Some species believe they deserve admission simply because they have achieved spaceflight. They are usually disappointed." Jake heard whispers around him. A group of blue-skinned beings with tentacles instead of arms were speaking quickly in their own language. The translation device in his ear picked up fragments. "Primitive species, barely developed, mathematical capacity of children." He turned slightly and saw they were looking at him. Heat rose in his cheeks, but he kept his face calm. He had expected this. Humans were new to the galactic community. Most other species had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, while humans were still figuring out how to make fire. "The examination will begin in 1 hour, Crixvel announced. "You will have 4 hours to complete a single mathematical challenge. There are no second chances. Failure means immediate expulsion and a permanent ban from all Galactic Academy institutions throughout the galaxy." The crowd began to move toward different areas of the hall. Jake noticed that students from the same species stayed together, forming study groups and sharing notes on devices he could not even identify. He found a quiet corner and sat on his bag. Other students around him were reviewing materials that looked impossibly complex. Holographic displays showed equations that moved and shifted in 3 dimensions. Some students had devices that projected mathematical formulas directly into their brains. Jake pulled out a notebook and pen from his bag. Several nearby students stopped what they were doing to stare at him. He heard someone make a sound that his translator interpreted as laughter. "Is that primitive recording device functional?" asked a voice behind him. Jake turned to see one of the crystal beings, a selenite looking down at his notebook with what might have been curiosity. "It works fine," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "How do you input multidimensional calculations into such a simple matrix?" the selenite asked. Its voice sounded like wind chimes. "I write them down," Jake said. The selenite made another chiming sound. "How inefficient. How do you process quantum probability shifts without direct neural interface?" "I think about them," Jake replied. The selenite paused for a moment, then moved away, making sounds that Jake's translator could not interpret. He caught the word primitive several times. Jake opened his notebook and started reviewing basic mathematical principles. Around him, other students worked with tools that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies. He had a pencil and paper. As the hour passed, Jake noticed something interesting. While the other students were clearly more advanced in their technology and mathematical knowledge, they also seemed incredibly stressed. Many were breathing hard, their strange alien faces showing signs of panic and worry. The Vorthak students were running calculations on devices that hurt to look at directly. The selenites were creating light patterns that probably represented mathematics Jake could not even imagine. Even the four-armed gray beings were working frantically, all four hands moving across different control surfaces at once. But they all looked terrified. Jake closed his notebook and took a deep breath. Whatever this test was, he would face it the same way he had always faced difficult problems, one step at a time, using the tools he had, and trusting that sometimes the simple approach worked better than the complicated one. Around him, the greatest mathematical minds in the galaxy prepared for an examination designed to break them. Jake Martinez from Earth sat quietly in his corner, holding a pencil, and waited to see what would happen next. The examination hall was 3 times larger than a football field. 847 students sat at individual desks that floated 3 feet off the ground. The desks adjusted automatically to fit each species, growing taller for the long-necked Altarians and wider for the bulky granite folk. Jake's desk was simple compared to the others. While alien students had surfaces that glowed and hummed with energy, his looked like a regular table with a datapad on top. He could hear the soft buzzing and clicking sounds from the advanced equipment around him. "You have 4 hours," Headmaster Crixvel announced from the front of the hall. "Begin now." Jake touched his datapad and the screen came to life. What he saw made his heart sink. The screen showed a 9x9 grid filled with strange symbols, but that was not the worst part. Below the grid were pages and pages of mathematical formulas that looked like nothing he had ever seen before. Equations with symbols that twisted and moved, mathematical proofs that stretched across multiple dimensions, formula chains that seemed to go on forever. Around him, Jake heard the sounds of other students getting to work immediately. The Vorthak students began typing so fast their fingers were just blurs. Holographic displays appeared above their desks, showing complex 3-dimensional mathematical models. The selenites started creating patterns of light that danced above their workstations. Jake's translator tried to interpret what they were doing but gave up and just displayed error messages. Their mathematics was too advanced for the device to understand. The four-armed gray students, called Zentari, used all their hands at once to work on different parts of the problem. Each hand seemed to be solving a separate piece of the puzzle, while their large brains kept track of everything at the same time. Jake looked back at his screen and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The first page of formulas dealt with something called quantum probability matrices in 17-dimensional space. The second page was about temporal mathematical constants across parallel calculation streams. He did not understand any of it, but he kept reading, hoping to find something familiar. Page after page of advanced mathematics flowed past. Some equations were so complex they made his eyes water just looking at them. Others used symbols that seemed to move and change shape as he watched. After 30 minutes, Jake heard the first sound of distress. A student 3 rows ahead was breathing very hard. Jake could not tell what species it was, but the creature was making high-pitched sounds that his translator said meant panic. Two more students started showing signs of stress. One began rocking back and forth in their chair. Another was hitting their desk with frustration. Jake looked around and saw that while everyone was working intensively, many looked worried. The Vorthak students, known for their perfect logic, had expressions that seemed strained. Even the confident Selenites were working more frantically than before. He went back to his own problem and tried a different approach. Instead of trying to understand all the complex mathematics, he focused just on the 9x9 grid at the top of the screen. The grid was filled with symbols he had never seen before. They looked like a mixture of geometric shapes and flowing curves. Some spaces in the grid were filled with these symbols. Others were empty, waiting to be completed. Jake stared at the pattern for several minutes. There was something about it that seemed familiar, but he could not figure out what. Then he noticed something interesting. There were exactly 9 different symbols scattered throughout the grid. And when he looked more carefully, he saw that some rows had more symbols than others. Some columns did too. He started counting. In the first row, he found 6 different symbols with 3 empty spaces. In the first column, he counted 7 symbols with 2 empty spaces. A thought began to form in his mind, but it seemed too simple, too easy. Around him, the sounds of intense mathematical work continued. He heard one student start crying. The high-pitched sounds came from somewhere behind him, and 2 Vorthak proctors moved quickly to escort the failing student out of the hall. More students were removed over the next hour. Jake watched as brilliant minds from across the galaxy broke down under the pressure of the examination. These were students who could calculate the orbital mechanics of entire solar systems, and they were being defeated by this single problem. Jake turned back to his grid and tried to ignore all the complex mathematics below it. He focused only on the pattern of symbols. He took out his paper notebook and drew the grid by hand. Then he started assigning numbers to the symbols. The first symbol he called 1, the second symbol he called 2, and so on until all 9 symbols had numbers. When he rewrote the grid using numbers instead of alien symbols, his heart started beating faster. It looked exactly like a Sudoku puzzle. Jake had been doing Sudoku puzzles since he was 12 years old. His grandmother had taught him during summer visits, and he had gotten very good at them over the years. He could usually solve even the hardest puzzles in about 20 minutes. But this could not be right. This was supposed to be the most difficult mathematical examination in the galaxy. It was designed to test the greatest minds from dozens of advanced species. It could not possibly be just a simple number puzzle that humans did for fun. He looked around at the other students. They were all working frantically on the complex equations. Some had filled their holographic displays with mathematical proofs that reached toward the ceiling. Others were running calculations that involved concepts Jake had never heard of. But what if they were all making the same mistake? What if they were trying to solve a problem that was much simpler than it appeared? Jake looked at his notebook grid again. If this really was Sudoku, then all the complex mathematics on the other pages was just decoration. The real puzzle was the 9x9 grid. And the only rule was that each row, each column, and each 3x3 box needed to contain all 9 symbols exactly once. Another student was escorted out of the hall. Then another. Jake counted the empty desks and realized that over 50 students had already given up or broken down completely. He made a decision. Jake ignored everything except the grid. He started solving it using simple Sudoku logic, the same methods his grandmother had taught him years ago. He looked for obvious placements first, then used elimination to figure out where the remaining symbols had to go. As he worked, the complex mathematical chaos around him faded into background noise. He was no longer in a galactic examination, hall surrounded by the greatest minds in the universe. He was just a guy solving a puzzle with a pencil and paper, the way humans had been doing for generations. The grid began to fill in, one symbol at a time. Jake worked steadily on his paper grid while chaos continued around him. The sounds of alien technology humming and buzzing filled the air, but he blocked them out. His pencil moved across the page in simple, careful strokes. In the third row, he could see that only 2 symbols were missing. Looking at the column rules and the 3x3 box rules, only one symbol could go in the empty space in the corner. He filled it in. The process felt natural and calm. While other students wrestled with equations about 17-dimensional mathematics, Jake used logic that any human child could follow. If this symbol goes here, then that symbol must go there. If these three spaces need these three symbols, then this one must be the right choice. A loud crash came from somewhere behind him. Jake looked up to see a Zentari student standing over their broken workstation. All four of the creature's arms were shaking with frustration. Sparks flew from the destroyed equipment as two proctors moved to escort the student away. "This is impossible," the Zentari said in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "The quantum calculations do not resolve. The mathematical framework contradicts itself." Jake watched the student leave, then turned back to his paper. He was halfway done with the puzzle now. The bottom right section was almost complete, and he could see where the remaining symbols had to go. More students around him were showing signs of breaking down. A group of Selenites had created a massive light display above their desks. The patterns were beautiful, but seemed to be growing, more chaotic by the minute. Jake could hear frustrated chiming sounds as they worked. 3 seats to his left, one of the tall gray Vorthak students was typing so fast that smoke was rising from their workstation. The creature's red eyes were wide with stress, and Jake could see mathematical formulas scrolling past on their screen faster than he could read. "The temporal constants are shifting," the Vorthak muttered. "The probability matrices will not stabilize in higher dimensions." Jake filled in another symbol on his grid. 2 more spaces in the middle section became obvious once he placed that one. The puzzle was working exactly like every Sudoku he had ever solved. Each symbol he placed made the next choices clearer. The difference was that Jake was using a pencil and paper, while everyone else was using technology that probably cost more than his entire hometown. But his simple tools were working perfectly for this problem. He heard another student cry out in frustration. This time it was one of the crystal-skinned beings whose species was famous for pattern recognition. The creature was staring at a holographic display that showed mathematical relationships in 3 dimensions. But the patterns kept changing and shifting. "The algorithmic sequences are recursive," the crystal being said. "Each solution leads to 17 new variable sets." Jake looked at the creature's display and saw equations that twisted through the air like living things. They were beautiful and complex, but they seemed to be making the problem harder instead of easier. He went back to his paper grid. Only 12 empty spaces remained. The logic was getting easier as more symbols were placed. In the top left corner, he could see exactly where the last 3 symbols had to go. As Jake worked, he began to notice something troubling about the other students. They were not just struggling with the mathematics. They were actively making the problem more difficult for themselves. A Selenite student had covered their entire desk with light patterns that represented mathematical relationships. But the patterns were so complex that the students seemed lost in their own creation. They kept adding more layers of analysis instead of looking for simple solutions. The Vorthak students were running calculations that involved concepts Jake had never heard of. They were treating the problem like it required perfect mathematical logic, but they were using logic so advanced that it was leading them in circles. Even the Zentari, with their 4 arms and large brains, were trying to solve multiple aspects of the problem simultaneously. But instead of making them faster, it seemed to be making them confused. Each arm was working on a different mathematical approach, and the approaches were contradicting each other. Jake realized what was happening. All of these species were incredibly intelligent, but their intelligence was getting in the way. They were so used to solving complex problems that they could not see simple solutions. He filled in 3 more symbols on his grid. Only 9 empty spaces left. The sounds around him were getting more desperate. Students were breathing hard, making frustrated noises, and occasionally shouting at their equipment. Several more had been escorted out of the hall after their workstations broke down or they collapsed from stress. Jake looked up and saw that at least 100 desks were empty now. The greatest mathematical minds in the galaxy were being defeated by a puzzle that appeared in human newspapers every day. He turned back to his grid and placed 2 more symbols. The bottom section was completely done now. The middle section had only 3 empty spaces, and he could see exactly where each symbol belonged. A Vorthak proctor walked past Jake's desk and stopped. The tall creature looked down at Jake's paper, notebook with what might have been confusion. The proctor's red eyes moved from the simple pencil and paper to the complex holographic displays around them. "Candidate," the proctor said in a voice like grinding stone, "your computational matrix appears to be malfunctioning." Jake looked up at the 9-foot-tall alien. "It's working fine. You are not utilizing multidimensional analysis protocols," the proctor said. "Your approach lacks quantum mathematical framework." "I don't need those things," Jake said. The proctor stared at him for a long moment. Around them, other students continued their frantic work with advanced technology and complex mathematics. The air filled with the sounds of alien frustration and breaking equipment. "Curious," the proctor said finally, and moved on. Jake placed another symbol on his grid. 5 empty spaces remaining. He realized that he was probably going to finish this puzzle soon, maybe in the next 10 minutes. While students with superior technology and advanced mathematical training were still struggling with the complex equations, he would be done using nothing but basic logic and a pencil. The thought made him smile a little. His grandmother would have found this amusing. She had always said that the best way to solve a puzzle was to ignore everything that did not matter and focus on what was actually important. Jake filled in 2 more symbols, 3 spaces left. Around him, the examination continued. Brilliant minds from across the galaxy wrestled with mathematics that would have impressed the greatest scientists on Earth. But Jake was finishing a simple puzzle using methods that any human child could understand. He placed the last 3 symbols on his grid and looked at his completed solution. Every row had all 9 symbols, every column had all 9 symbols, every 3x3 box had all 9 symbols. The puzzle was solved. Jake looked at the complex mathematics still displayed on his datapad screen and realized that none of it had been necessary. The alien symbols, the advanced equations, the multidimensional theories, they were all just decoration around a simple logic puzzle. He had finished the most difficult examination in the galaxy, using the same methods his grandmother had taught him on lazy summer afternoons. The same methods that millions of humans use to relax and have fun. Jake looked around the hall and saw that most students were still working frantically. Some looked close to panic. Others seemed lost in their own complex calculations. He had solved the puzzle, but now he had to decide what to do next. Should he submit his answer? Should he wait to see if others finished? Should he double-check his work? Jake decided to double-check. He went through his grid one more time, counting symbols in each row, column, and box. Everything was correct. He had solved the impossible examination. Now he just had to turn it in. Jake sat quietly at his desk for the remaining 2 hours of the examination. Around him, the sounds of struggle continued. More students were escorted out as their equipment failed or they collapsed from exhaustion. The brilliant minds of the galaxy were being broken one by one. He used the extra time to check his solution again and again. Every row contained all 9 symbols. Every column contained all 9 symbols. Every 3x3 box contained all 9 symbols. The logic was perfect and simple. When the final hour began, Jake counted the remaining students. Less than 200 were left out of the original 847. Empty desks filled the massive hall like missing teeth. The students, who remained, looked desperate. A selenite near the front was creating light patterns so complex they hurt to look at directly. The patterns kept collapsing and reforming as the creature tried different mathematical approaches. 2 Vorthak students were working together, their workstations connected by streams of energy. Their calculations had grown so complex that holographic equations floated 15 feet above their desks. But Jake could see frustration in their glowing red eyes. "Time," Headmaster Crixvell announced. The sound of working technology stopped immediately. Students sat back in their chairs, many breathing heavily. Some looked relieved that the torture was over. Others stared at their screens with obvious disappointment. All candidates who have completed solutions, submit them now, the headmaster said. Jake looked around the hall. Most students were not moving. They sat at their desks with incomplete work or broken equipment. After 4 hours of intense effort, they had nothing to show for it. But Jake saw a few students reaching for their submission controls. He counted them quickly. 11 other students were submitting answers, including himself. That made 12. Jake touched the submit button on his datapad. His simple grid solution uploaded to the Academy's system. Examination complete, Crixvell announced. All candidates remain seated while solutions are reviewed. The headmaster moved to a large display at the front of the hall. Jake watched as the submitted solutions appeared on the screen one by one. Each solution was enormous, filled with complex mathematics that stretched across multiple screens. The first solution came from a Vorthak student. It contained hundreds of pages of quantum mechanical proofs. The mathematics was so advanced that Jake could not even read the symbols. But after several minutes of review, Crixvell made a sound that Jake's translator interpreted as disappointment. Incorrect, the headmaster announced. Fundamental error in dimensional matrix calculations. The second solution was from a selenite. It was presented as a three-dimensional light pattern that rotated slowly above the display. The pattern was beautiful and incredibly complex, but after careful study, Crixvell rejected it as well. Incorrect. Recursive algorithm failure in probability assessment. One by one, the solutions were reviewed and rejected. Each one represented hours of intense work by some of the galaxy's most brilliant minds. Each one was wrong. Jake watched his fellow students as their solutions were dismissed. Some looked shocked. Others seemed angry. A few appeared to be crying, though with alien faces it was hard to tell. The ninth solution lasted longer than the others. It came from a four-armed Zentari student and filled the entire display with mathematical relationships. Crixvell studied it for nearly 10 minutes before making his decision. Incorrect. Approach shows exceptional mathematical sophistication, but reaches false conclusion due to overanalysis of secondary variables. 10 solutions rejected. 1 remained. Jake's solution appeared on the screen. The hall fell silent. After seeing hundreds of pages of advanced mathematics, Jake's solution looked impossibly simple. It was just a 9x9 grid filled with symbols, accompanied by a single page of basic explanation. But it looked wrong. Compared to the other solutions, it looked like a child's drawing next to masterpiece paintings. Crixvell stared at the screen for a long moment. His red eyes moved across Jake's grid, checking each row and column. The silence stretched on until Jake could hear his own heartbeat. This solution, Crixvell said slowly, appears to be... He paused, checking the grid again. Correct. A sound, like a gasp, went through the hall. Students turned to look at each other with confusion and disbelief. Jake felt hundreds of alien eyes searching the room to see who had submitted the simple solution. Candidate Martinez, Crixvell called. Approach, the front. Jake stood up on shaking legs. The walk to the front of the hall felt like it took forever. He could feel every alien in the room watching him. Some made sounds that his translator said were expressions of disbelief. When he reached the front, Crixvell towered over him. The headmaster's metal black skin reflected the lights of the hall, and his red eyes seemed to burn with intensity. Explain your solution, Crixvell demanded. Jake looked up at the massive alien and tried to keep his voice steady. Everyone else was trying to solve the mathematical equations, but they were missing the real puzzle. The real puzzle? Crixvell's voice was dangerous. The 9x9 grid, Jake said. All those equations and formulas were just decoration. The actual problem was a simple logic puzzle. Each row, column, and 3x3 box needs to contain each symbol exactly once. The hall erupted in noise. Students were talking, shouting, and making sounds of disbelief in dozens of languages. Jake's translator gave up trying to interpret everything and just displayed error messages. Crixvell raised one massive hand and the hall fell silent again. You ignored the mathematical framework entirely? The headmaster asked. Yes, Jake said. It wasn't needed. The puzzle had its own simple rules. Simple rules. Crixvel repeated the words like they tasted strange. On Earth, we call this type of puzzle Sudoku, Jake explained. Children solve them for fun. The hard part is not the mathematics. The hard part is seeing that you don't need mathematics at all. Crixvel turned to look at the display screen where Jake's solution was still shown. The simple 9x9 grid sat next to the rejected solutions with their hundreds of pages of complex calculations. You solved our most difficult examination, Crixvel said, using methods a child could understand. Yes, Jake said. The headmaster was quiet for a long moment. Around the hall, students stared at the human who had done the impossible. Some looked angry. Others looked confused. A few seemed to be studying Jake like he was a puzzle they needed to solve. For 47 years, Crixvel said finally, this examination has defeated the greatest minds from 17 different species. Mathematical geniuses who can calculate the movement of entire galaxies have been broken by this test. He turned his burning red eyes back to Jake. And you solved it with a pencil and paper. Yes, Jake said. How? Jake thought about how to explain. Sometimes the hardest problems have the simplest solutions. You just have to be willing to ignore everything that doesn't matter and focus on what actually needs to be done. Crixvel stared at him for another long moment. Then something strange happened. The corners of the headmaster's mouth moved upward, in what might have been a smile. Congratulations, Candidate Martinez, Crixvel said. You are admitted to the Zentari Galactic Academy. The hall remained silent as Jake walked back to his desk. But he could feel something had changed. The other students were no longer looking at him like he was a primitive creature who didn't belong. They were looking at him like he was something they had never seen before. Something that might be very dangerous to underestimate. The news spread through the Galactic Academy like wildfire. Within hours, every student and faculty member knew about the human who had solved the impossible examination with a pencil and paper. By the next day, the story had reached every major world in the galaxy. Jake found himself sitting in Headmaster Crixvel's office 3 days after the examination. The room was enormous, with walls covered in mathematical equations that moved and shifted like living things. But Jake was no longer intimidated by such displays. We have a problem, Mr. Martinez, Crixvel said. The massive Vorthak was sitting behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of black crystal. Your solution has exposed a fundamental flaw in our educational system. Jake waited for the headmaster to continue. For centuries, we have been creating these examinations to test mathematical aptitude, Crixvel explained. We believed we were identifying the most capable minds in the galaxy, but you have shown us that we were testing the wrong things entirely. The headmaster touched a control on his desk. The wall behind him displayed Jake's simple 9x9 grid next to the complex mathematical frameworks that had defeated hundreds of other students. We were so focused on advanced theoretical knowledge that we forgot about basic problem-solving skills, Crixvel continued. Your species possesses something we had not recognized as valuable, the ability to see simple solutions, hidden within complex presentations. Jake shifted in his chair. Most humans would have solved that puzzle the same way I did. Exactly, Crixvel said. That is what makes this discovery so significant. What we considered a unique intellectual achievement is actually a common human trait. Over the following weeks, Jake began his studies at the academy, but his experience was unlike that of any previous student. Instead of struggling to keep up with advanced alien mathematics, he found that his human perspective was giving him advantages he had never expected. In his first physics class, Professor Zenth presented a problem about calculating the energy required to move a moon from one orbit to another. The other students immediately began working with equations involving gravitational matrices, temporal displacement factors, and quantum mechanical energy states. Jake looked at the problem differently. He ignored the complex calculations and focused on the basic question: how much energy does it take to move something heavy from here to there? He used simple physics principles that any human engineer would recognize and arrived at the correct answer in 10 minutes. The professor stared at Jake's solution with the same confusion that Crixvel had shown during the entrance exam. This approach is far too simple, Professor Zenth said. You have not accounted for 17 different variable factors. Those factors cancel each other out, Jake explained. When you add them all together, they equal 0. So the simple calculation gives the same answer as the complex one. The professor spent an hour checking Jake's work and finally admitted that the human was correct. The 17 variable factors did indeed cancel out, leaving only the basics energy calculation that Jake had used from the beginning. Word of Jake's unconventional methods continued to spread. Faculty members began attending his classes to watch the human student solve problems in ways they had never seen before. In his mathematics course, Jake was presented with a problem about calculating probability distributions across multiple dimensional spaces. While other students worked with equations that filled entire holographic displays, Jake drew a simple diagram on paper and used basic statistical methods. His answer was correct, and it had taken him 15 minutes instead of the 3 hours the other students needed. Professor Yithvel, a Selenite mathematician, approached Jake after class. Your methods are disturbing to observe, the crystal-skinned being said. You solve complex problems as if they were simple puzzles. Maybe they are simple puzzles, Jake replied. Maybe we just make them complex because we think complex means better. The professor's light patterns flickered in what Jake had learned was the Selenite equivalent of deep thought. You believe that complexity can hide simplicity? Professor Yithvel asked. I think complexity can be used to make simple things look impressive, Jake said. Sometimes the best solution is the obvious one. As weeks passed, Jake's influence on the academy grew. Other students began asking him to explain his methods. Faculty members requested demonstrations of human problem-solving techniques. Jake found himself teaching informal classes where he showed alien students how to approach problems the way humans did. He introduced concepts that seemed revolutionary to the galactic academic community, but were basic ideas on Earth. He taught them about Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation was usually correct. He showed them lateral thinking, where you approached problems from unexpected angles. He demonstrated how breaking complex problems into small, simple pieces could make them easier to solve. The alien students were fascinated and frustrated in equal measure. Species that had built their entire educational systems around advanced theoretical frameworks struggled to accept that simple approaches could be more effective, but the results spoke for themselves. Students who learned Jake's methods began solving problems faster and with fewer errors. They started seeing solutions that had been hidden by unnecessary complexity. 6 months after Jake's arrival, Headmaster Crixvel called him back to his office. Mr. Martinez, the headmaster said, the Galactic Academic Council has made a decision. They want you to develop a new curriculum based on human problem-solving methods. Jake was surprised. You want me to teach? We want you to revolutionize how we teach, Crixvel corrected. Your approaches have shown success rates that exceed our traditional methods by significant margins. Students who learn your techniques are solving problems that previously defeated our most advanced scholars. What about the other faculty members? Jake asked. They've been teaching their methods for thousands of years. They are learning your methods too, Crixvel said with what might have been amusement. Professor Yithvel submitted a research paper last week titled The Computational Advantages of Primitive Logic Systems. Professor Zenth has requested permission to spend a sabbatical year on Earth studying human educational techniques. Jake smiled. So the primitive species is teaching the advanced ones? The primitive species, Crixvel said, has reminded the advanced ones that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Advanced knowledge is useless if it prevents you from seeing simple truths. A year later, Jake stood in front of a classroom filled with students from 12 different species. On the board behind him were problems that would have seemed impossible when he first arrived at the academy. But now, his students solved them routinely, using methods that any human child could understand. Today, we're going to work on something that the academy has called unsolvable for 3 centuries, Jake announced. He posted the problem on the main display. It looked incredibly complex, filled with alien mathematics and theoretical frameworks. But Jake had learned to see past such complexity. The first step, he told his students, is to ignore everything that looks impressive and focus on what the problem is actually asking. A young Vorthak student raised one of his four hands. Professor Martinez, what if the impressive parts are important? Jake smiled. Then we'll add them back in after we solve the simple version. But most of the time, we won't need to. He picked up a piece of chalk and began drawing a simple diagram on the board. Let's start with what we know for certain and work from there. As Jake taught, he thought about his grandmother and the summer afternoons when she had introduced him to Sudoku puzzles. She had told him that the best way to solve any puzzle was to ignore everything that didn't matter and focus on what was or actually important. Now, years later and thousands of light years from Earth, Jake was teaching that same wisdom to the brightest minds in the galaxy, and they were finally learning to listen. Outside the classroom windows, stars wheeled across the alien sky. Somewhere among them was a small blue planet where humans solved puzzles with pencils and paper, never realizing that their simple methods would one day revolutionize galactic education. Jake turned back to his students and continued the lesson. There were still many complex problems to solve, and the best way to solve them was one simple step at a time.